So I'll be using the next 10 minutes to tell you about 3 things that I deem very important in terms of conservation for 2009 and the years beyond, which are species conservation, and then foresighted conservation, and the third one is the evaluation of conservation. So I'm very grateful to Ben to have mentioned the 2010 target, Convention on Biodiversity, and this target, as we just heard, is not being met. And I can tell you one reason for the target not being met actually by any country in the world, which is that there is simply not enough money in biodiversity conservation, wildlife conservation worldwide to be able to meet these targets. This is, by the way, a blue-eyed black lemur from Madagascar, a critically endangered species on the brink of extinction, the only species of primate apart from humans with blue eyes. And species conservation, what do I mean with species conservation? Basically, this is a movement which started in the late 19th century. There are some very early heroes of species conservation, one of them being William Temple Hornaday, whom you can see there on the left, with a bison calf. He was actually the person who championed the conservation of the American bison, and he wrote a pamphlet on conservation of the American bison in 1887 already. Another one is the 11th Duke of Bedford, whom you can see there on the left, and he actually championed the conservation of the pair David's deer, the Milu, this deer species here on the picture. The pair David's deer was discovered by Father Armand David in the late 19th century in basically the backyard of a palace of the Chinese emperor. He climbed a wall and spotted these unusual deer in this palace yard and described them as a new species. And this was the only place where these deer were actually lived. There were none in the wild, and unfortunately in the Boxer Rebellion, all the deer in the emperor's palace backyard were eaten by Western and Japanese soldiers, so they weren't left there anymore either. Fortunately, people like the Duke of Bedford and others had imported some illegally into Europe and North America. They were all combined in the Duke of Bedford's estate in Woburn Abbey and then bred in captivity, and we still have Per David's deer in this world today. So what I wanted to say is actually how important species conservation is. After the Second World War, a number of conservation organizations were founded, WWF for example, and then later the Wildlife Conservation Society, the Nature Conservancy in the US, Conservation International also in the US, and various others, which were founded to protect the world's endangered species. Back in the 19th century, species conservation was a field for interested people like hunters, scientists, and others who actually came back from all sorts of places in the world with new species that they have discovered, and then found out that some of these species were really endangered in the wild. And the problem, which is actually now which I wanted to draw your attention to, is that species conservation itself is an endangered species. Ben has talked a bit about sustainability, and the Rio de Janeiro summit in 1992 sort of was one of the first, or maybe the first world summit where sustainability agenda and poverty alleviation agenda of the world, of the nations of the world, were put to the attention of the media and of the people. This was followed by, for example, things like the Millennium Development Goals from the United Nations Development Program in 2000. And the thing is that these things, however important they are, actually get into the place of direct species conservation in terms of competing for funding. Now most of the world's authorities actually regard species conservation as a minor thing when it comes to poverty alleviation and sustainability. Basically what people say is that species conservation should be met by looking at these things, these bigger things, first of all. It should be met by addressing things like poverty, human poverty in the world, and health things and stuff like that. The policy is to address these things with the available funding, and then basically what the thought is behind it is that species conservation will come itself out of this. And this is actually not the case in all of these cases. This is just to show you some photos about poverty alleviation and things that are on the agenda of the UNDP Millennium Development Goals. Building schools, for example, employing teachers, income-generating activities for humans, and all sorts of things which are all worthwhile. But I argue here that species conservation, biodiversity conservation, does not necessarily come out of putting lots of funding into development itself. This is the same example as before, the blue-eyed black lemur again. This is what Bristol Zoo and a couple of other zoos are doing in Madagascar. Direct species conservation. We are really there's not many funds where we can actually tap into to get money for direct conservation measures. So we have to basically apply for the same funding as development agencies apply to get some money for these sort of things. So that's the first thing. The second thing is foresighted conservation that I'd like to draw your attention to. This is a map showing the southern tip of Africa. You can see Cape Point here. Cape Town is about here. And these yellow and red areas here show the anchovy density in grams per square meter in the Indian Ocean here, in the Atlantic Ocean over there. This is the Benguela upwelling, which is a system of warm water that moves north alongside the South African coast up to Namibia in the Atlantic Ocean, and brings all sorts of phytoplankton with it, and zooplankton. And these are actually here the main fishing grounds for seabirds, penguins and other seabird species. Whereas, as you can see, all the anchovies, and the same is true for sardines, which is another food species of seabird, are down there, situated in the Indian Ocean part of this system.
Christoph, you've got 1 minute.
Okay, sorry. So there's a big mismatch between these two things. And we are now actually looking into how we can develop a new methodology of getting penguins to establish new colonies where they haven't been before, where they are closer to the fish stocks. So we are not actually at Bristol Zoo looking at these problems or where they come from. We are looking into very pragmatically how we can establish a methodology to get the penguins where they need to be. And this is, I think, what zoos need to focus on, and other conservation organizations as well in the future, to be looking into the future and to see what can be done. And that's the same for climate change. Actually, here animals will migrate out of protected areas in the future because climate is changing and they can't stay in where they used to be, and we have to be foresighted and see where they will actually move and how we can address these problems. And the last one, very quickly, evaluating conservation will be a focus for conservation organizations. We are doing a lot, but how can we prove it? How can we actually say what we are doing, how effective is what we are doing? We are doing that in the wild and in the zoo as well. That's a question that zoos are asked as well. more and more often? How effective is it what you are doing in terms of communication as well as in terms of conservation? Can you actually prove that you are protecting these species? Can you prove that you are spreading the word out to the world and to your audiences? And that's it. Thank you very much.